Hello again, this is Alister McGrath at Oxford University. And I'm continuing this series of 18 short introductory presentations about Christian theology. Now, as I said earlier, what I'm trying to do here is provide you with a sketch map of the territory of Christian theology that will help you grasp the basic themes of Christian theology and also how these help us shape our understanding of ourselves and our world. You look at these ideas, you look through these ideas, which gives you a new way of seeing yourself and the world. In this fourth presentation, I want to talk about the history of theology. I think it's a very important point to realize that 2,000 years of Christian theology is a long time, and a lot has happened during that period. And what I want to do is break this down into a number of manageable segments, just to help you get a sense of what was happening in each of these, what they are usually called in the textbooks you're going to be reading, and how these actually make sense to us today. And there are 5 main periods of theology: the Apostolic Period, early Christianity, the Middle Ages, the Reformation and Post-Reformation periods, and the modern period. So let's look at each of those briefly and try and get a sense of why they're important, how they fit into our own thinking. We begin with the first one, and that's the Apostolic Period. Now, the first century is often referred to as the Apostolic Period. It's a period during which the works that are now included in the New Testament were written. And during this time, Christianity was spreading throughout the Mediterranean region and beyond through the work of apostles like Peter and Paul. I'm sure you've read all about the missionary journeys of St. Paul, which are described in the Acts of the Apostles. So that's the first period, the Apostolic Period. That's followed by what is now usually known as the period of the early church, but sometimes this is called the Patristic Period. And that's usually held to begin about the year 100. And the Council of Chalcedon in 451 marked a landmark in Christian thinking, especially about the identity of Christ, and many historians of theology see this as marking the end of this first period, the Patristic Period. The word is very often used because, of course, early Christian writers were called fathers. The Latin word is pater. Patristic means belonging to these writers. Nowadays, we often use early Christian theology to refer to this instead, and it includes writers like Irenaeus of Lyon, Clement of Alexandria, the Cappadocian Fathers, Athanasius, Augustine of Hippo. It's a really important period, and it witnessed important theological explorations of a number of themes. For example, the relation of faith and classical culture, the place of the Bible in Christian theology, including fixing the New Testament canon, the identity of Jesus Christ, the doctrine of God, particularly the Trinity, and the relation of grace and free will, not to mention the doctrine of the Church. Let's look at one example. We're going to focus on what's called Christology, the Christian understanding of Jesus Christ. And the Patristic Period saw clarification of the identity and significance of Christ as being of the utmost importance. How do you locate Christ on a theological map? And the period witnessed growing acceptance of what's called the two natures doctrine, along with exploration of how best to make sense of Christ being both divine and human. What's sometimes called the Arian and Nestorian debates were of particular importance in clarifying this matter. Then we come to our third period, the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages, sometimes called the medieval period, is usually seen as extending from the end of the patristic era to about the year 1500. And this long period was immensely creative theologically. It produced theological classics like Thomas Aquinas' great 13th century work, the Summa Theologica. In English, the Totality of Theology. And other major theologians of this period include Anselm of Canterbury, Bonaventure, Duns Scotus, and William of Ockham. So what happened during this period? Well, many issues were explored in depth. For example, the relationship between faith and reason, and of course the question of how to interpret the Bible. And the Middle Ages saw new attention being given to a whole range of issues concerning the relation of faith and reason, or theology and philosophy. And one reason for this was the emergence of universities in Western Europe, for example, the University of Paris. And the debates about whether God's existence could be proved are good examples of this engagement with rational culture. Aquinas' 5 ways of proving God's existence remain discussed today. Next we come to the Reformation and Post-Reformation period. Now, this third period is very important. As you know, the 16th century marked a period of Reformation, which witnessed the birth of Protestantism through writers like Martin Luther and John Calvin. And certain theological debates became really heated around this time. For example, the place of the Bible in theological reflection, the doctrine of the Church, and the question of what it is necessary to do in order to be saved. And many of these questions became important because of the controversies between Protestants and Catholics about the nature of Christianity and indeed the nature of the Church. As you know, the Catholic Church also went through a period of reformation around this time, with the Council of Trent setting out the definitive Catholic position on issues of importance. Now, lots of interesting things happen during this period. I think one of the most interesting relates to Protestantism, when 2 new styles of theological texts make their appearance. Both of these are linked with Protestantism. One of them is Melanchthon's Commonplaces. Again, Commonplaces. The other is John Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. Very influential works, widely imitated. Also, people began to use catechisms extensively with a distinctive question and answer format. And that proved to be really important both in Christian education in general, but also in theological education. Now, the theological debates of this period between Protestants and Catholics often concerned whether the Bible had an independent authority in relation to the Church, and whether the Bible could be interpreted without the guidance of the Church. So, really important questions being discussed there. That brings us to the 4th period, which is, of course, the 5th period, which is the modern period. Again, the modern period. It is a period of considerable instability in Western Europe, especially following the French Revolution of 1789, and later through the rise of Marxism in Eastern Europe in the 20th century. Obviously, these both pose challenges to Christianity, though in different ways. And yet, despite these difficulties, it appeared remarkable theological creativity throughout Western Europe and North America. And also, of course, during this period, theology began to emerge as a significant undertaking in Latin America, in Asia, and in Africa. And lots of theological issues were debated during the modern period. For example, a growing awareness on the part of Western theologians of the existence of other religions led to a new interest in clarifying the relationship of Christianity and other faiths. So although people knew about that in the past, for example in the Patristic Period, it became increasingly important during the modern period. But many traditional issues were still debated during the modern period. For example, the relation of faith and reason, the authority and interpretation of Scripture, the identity of Christ, the doctrine of the Trinity, and the nature and grounds of redemption. I think the important point to appreciate is that the rise of rationalism was very important. Rationalism said you don't need anything other than reason to make sense of the world or to know about God. And this led to a critique of a number of aspects of traditional Christian theology. And a very good example of this is the rise of what's sometimes called the historical Jesus movement. This really got underway because in the 18th century, people began to feel there was a gap between a Jesus of history, a very simple historical figure, and the church's rather more complex Christ of faith. So that was a very important debate, and it still continues, although I think it continues in a much more realistic way today. Rationalism, I think, began to lose its influence in the early 20th century as people began to realize the limits placed on human reason, and Christian theology began to rediscover the importance of revelation. And of course, if you're interested in the history of theology, one of the most interesting periods about the 20th century is its rediscovery of the importance of the doctrine of the Trinity as a distinctively Christian insight into the nature of God. And of course, there are many other debates during this period. For example, the growing realization of the importance of issues raised by feminist writers. For example, what do we mean when we speak about God as Father? Does that mean that God is male? Lots of questions there to be debated, and of course we'll look at this and other questions during this presentation. So again, think of 5 main periods of theology: the Apostolic Period, the Patristic Period, the Middle Ages, the Reformation, and the Modern Period. And that's a useful framework for beginning to think about the development of Christian theology. And of course, it's more complicated than that, but this is just a helpful way of mapping the complex history of Christian theology. So I think you'll find that useful. If I use words like patristic or medieval, you'll know what I'm getting at. Now again, let me make the point that this very brief survey of theological history can only skim the surface of some of the great themes that were explored during Christian history. But now we're ready to move on to 12 presentations in which we look specifically at the leading themes of Christian theology. And we're going to begin with the idea of faith. What's faith all about? I look forward to speaking to you again very soon as we explore what it means to believe. Thank you very much for listening.